Welcome back to the Passing Through podcast. This is not the episode you were supposed to hear this week. I had already recorded, edited, mastered, and was about to publish the episode that should be gracing your ears at the moment, and it included stories of our travels through Austria and Prague back to Wrocław, where I am passing through right now, because we had to come back here. We were summoned by the police. It was a kind of interesting story that I told you, but after I recorded all of this and was about to upload it, something in me felt that that isn't the important episode for me to record right now, because there's been something else that's on my mind. That was just kind of a quality of life update, filling you in on what's going on. And I don't know if that's the most important thing for me to be speaking about right now, because right now there are terrible atrocities and injustices happening in Gaza and the West Bank in Palestine. And I feel a certain obligation to talk about this, because so far I haven't taken a firm stance on that on this podcast. I've alluded to things. I've talked about the genocide that's happening there, but not really in detail, and not really explaining my thoughts, and not really giving context or shedding light on what's actually happening there. Because I think when I speak to people about this, whether that's here or back in the States, but particularly in the States, there isn't really a clear sense of what's happening. People just have this vague notion of brown people in the desert having a skirmish, and one of them is defending themselves, and the other is a bunch of terrorists. It's kind of like the narrative that we heard post 9/11, where the US had this kind of, I don't know, righteous indignation, where they were able to just go in and defend themselves against a brutal attack, a brutal act of terror, in this war on terror, and illegally invade a sovereign nation and indiscriminately bomb and take revenge out on a civilian population there in the name of eradicating terror. And when we look back on that moment in history, I think it's pretty roundly seen as a failure, a colossal failure for everyone. The United States wasn't made safer. The terrorists weren't stopped. And there was death toll on both sides. So people lost their lives in great numbers with no real benefit to anyone, save for maybe some politicians, the military industrial complex, and whoever else. But the average person in these places did not benefit at all from these things. In fact, Americans became less safe in the world, and not just Americans, but everybody else, because the world is interconnected. Everything is connected. And to me, more than anything, I think the situation in Gaza right now reflects that. There's something about what's happening there where we as a global people cannot sit still, or should not sit still and just watch idly as this happens. And so this podcast, this episode, is me speaking my mind a bit and trying to do it in a reasoned way that isn't angry, that isn't uncharitable to people who may be listening and who may have affiliations with Israel or Israel citizens. In the same way that when the US invaded Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, there were many American citizens protesting who were against this, who felt that this was wrong, and they did not want to be part of it. They petitioned their government. They tried to raise their voice and use their First Amendment right to condemn the government's acts with their freedom of speech. And that's happening right now in Israel too. Just recently, there was the largest protest since October 7th, since all of these things began almost a year ago. And a little asterisk there, they didn't just begin a year ago. That's another important point that I'll get to in a moment. But this protest was huge. People came out in record numbers. They were demanding a ceasefire. They were demanding the resignation of Netanyahu. And the Israeli government met them with brute force in the streets. They unleashed water cannons on them. They tear gassed them. They brutally beat them in the streets. And this is what happens. This doesn't just happen in Israel. This doesn't just happen in America. It happens all over the world. When people come out to peacefully protest against injustice, they are pepper sprayed, maced, beaten, incarcerated. It's maddening. And I'm going to try not to be angry about this and try to find peace despite the rage that I sometimes feel about this, about how our governments are no longer serving us, and about how we as people seem to be impotent, even though there are more of us than them. It's not an us and them thing. It's just by sheer numbers, if everyone went out to protest, our numbers overwhelm theirs, and yet the few are making the decisions for the many. And so it's kind of a tragic state of affairs at the moment. And I wonder what the way is to broker peace here and to reach understanding and to come together and to get governments to actually act in a way that generates more goodwill and peace and happiness for their people. Because what happens in one place affects everywhere else. Now more than ever, we know that we are global people. Our circles of compassion are ever widening. And what happens in one place affects another. I mean, the ecological impact of what's happening right now in Gaza should illustrate this pretty clearly. You know, anyone who's listened to this podcast for some time already knows that environmental issues are always present in my heart. It's something that I'm passionate about. And I was curious about what's happening there because, yes, there's a genocide happening there. And it's not just me who thinks that. This is a word that I use very carefully. This is a word that people shouldn't use lightly. Fittingly, the person who coined the term, Raphael Lemkin, in 1944, there's an institute, the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention. They accuse Israel of genocide. And that's just one of the many human rights organizations that condemn Israel of ethnic cleansing, apartheid, genocide. Even the International Court of Justice earlier in the year ruled that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. Most recently, they ruled that Israel is responsible for apartheid in Palestine. You know, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. So many people have accused Israel of, war crimes, human rights violations. So there's pretty general consensus about what's happening right now, but for some reason in certain Western media, notably in the US and the UK, it is contentious or controversial to use the word genocide, which is a very bizarre thing. And I guess we don't need to appeal to a certain word here. We can talk about actions, right? And that's what I'll do here. I want to put in some facts and talk about some things that are happening that you may not know about, just so you have food for thought, just to raise awareness, just to have a slightly different conversation. Because what word we use ultimately doesn't matter, right? When I say blue, you might think of a slightly different shade of blue. So instead of that, we can omit that word altogether and just talk about the quality of it. Is it the color of the sky? Is it the color of the sea? Is it the color of a blueberry? There's different ways that you could start to describe these things so people can understand what you're talking about. So that's what I'll try to do here. But I just wanted to go back to a string that I left hanging just now, which was about the environmental consequences and ramifications of what's happening and how everything is connected. So right now, in Palestine, Israel has devastated the infrastructure there, which in itself is a war crime. But they have destroyed all of the water treatment facilities. inside of Gaza. They are either completely destroyed or seriously dysfunctional. And all of that wastewater is just spilling out into, onto the land, into drinking water, into groundwater, and into the Mediterranean Sea. And when that waste goes into the Mediterranean Sea, it contaminates the sea. It goes to the seafloor, and it can cause toxic algae blooms. It can cause, heavy metals and chemicals and medical waste and human waste to bioaccumulate in the organisms that are there, in the plants and the marine life. And the Mediterranean isn't just a closed, encapsulated space off the coast of Palestine. It's an ecosystem. The same with the air quality there. All of the bombardment that's been happening in Gaza, and it's enormous. I'm going to give you a fact at the end of this podcast about that, but for now, if we just talk about the emissions aspect of this conflict, and we just narrow this window down to the aftermath of October 7th and February, there were roughly 244 cargo flights from the US to Israel, transporting 10,000 tons of equipment using an estimated 60 to 80 million liters of fuel. And now when you factor in Israeli fighter jets, surveillance aircrafts, all of this accumulates an additional 60 to 85 million liters of fuel, leaving a minimum of 260,000 tons and a maximum of 370,000 tons of CO2 emissions just from the flights. And then when you start thinking of the bombardments and the munitions and the shellings and the bombings and what that does to the air quality there when buildings are destroyed and asbestos is in the air or uranium from the explosions. Israel used white phosphorus in Gaza on October 11th, 2023. And this in itself is also another war crime. For the record. The use of white phosphorus is prohibited because it is very, very destructive, not just on the health of organisms, but for its impact on the environment, especially agricultural land. And Palestine and Gaza in general, this is an agricultural region. And something like between 30 and 50% of the agriculture there has been just obliterated and destroyed. This has downstream consequences in terms of the livelihoods of the people there, the future fertility of soil, for people to grow food, eat food, sustain themselves, but also for the region, for the animals that are indigenous to that region. If you cut off their food sources, these animals cannot survive or thrive there anymore. And so it affects and disrupts the entire ecosystem in this region. This conflict has long-lasting consequences, not just culturally on the Palestinian people and all the children who are orphaned and all the refugees and people who are stateless and have nowhere to go. Of course, that will last a lifetime and the lifetimes to follow. But for the region, it will take decades, maybe more, for things to recover from what's happening right now. So those clouds of air that are just around the city, they move, right? It's not just you bomb a place and all that dust settles on Gaza. It moves around the region. So there's particulate matter in the air there that is unsafe and hazardous to living things, just moving at higher concentrations throughout the region. This goes and affects the people in Israel as well. The same with the contaminated wastewater that's spilling out. It affects them too. So when we start to understand this and we realize the harm that we exact on our neighbors and on our alleged enemies also harms us, not just in a spiritual way, but in a real material way. So yeah, this is something that people don't often talk about, but there are people discussing this right now and using the term ecocide to describe what's happening there, because the devastation is so comprehensive and so far reaching that in order to properly signify the scale and urgency and destruction, people are using the word ecocide to describe it. Just a note about that. Under the Rome statutes, which govern international criminal court, it's a war crime to intentionally launch excessive attacks, knowing that it will cause widespread, long-term, severe damage to the natural environment. This is tragic. The effects that we are having, not just on human life, but on non-human life in these regions. I want to give a little bit of history or make a statement about how this mirrors what we're seeing in terms of the polycrisis. All of the facets of the polycrisis are on display here as we as a global people look and see these visceral consequences, as I just alluded to, with the harm to the non-human life that's there, to the human life, and how all of this comes as a consequence of a colonialist campaign of cruelty and exploitation and displacement and war and ethnic cleansing and extraction. We've seen this time and time and time again. And it's just right now, Israel's occupation, which is considered to be the longest military occupation in modern history, that's the one that has the world's attention at the moment. But this isn't the first time. Everything, the culture that we are steeped in right now is predicated on this. It's born of this. So watching what's happening there is like looking back into our history and seeing what the consequences are in real time, how this destroys the people, the culture, the land, the community. Just deep, deep harm. And militarizing these conquests, these colonial occupations, where often the occupier has financial backing or militaristic advantage, and the fight is in itself unfair. And like in the polycrisis, the people in Palestine are facing the same issues. We're facing endless war, water scarcity, food insecurity, displacement of indigenous peoples, destruction of natural habitats, a lack of social safety, systemic racism. And while all of this is happening, most of the world turns a blind eye or is ignorant to it. And I think we have an obligation as a global people to see what's happening to our people, because we are all in this together. We're all fish swimming in the same water. And when there's sewage pouring into the water, and there's radioactive waste and asbestos and heavy metals and white phosphorus and medical waste from bombed hospitals just leaking into that water that we're all swimming in, this affects us. This harms us. So we can't sit idly by and allow this to happen. We have to take steps to stop it and to protest it. And we can do that peacefully. We can come together. And there are people working to do things like this. A guest I hope to speak to soon just had an event in Berlin at the Holocaust Museum, where people assembled wearing white and gathered and prayed and peacefully held space to end the war in Gaza, to inspire people to have a ceasefire. And if this was happening more, maybe we would start to see a shift. We do see protests all across the world and a lot of major cities. And as I mentioned before, even in Israel, the people there don't want this war anymore. But we are at a point where it doesn't matter what the people want. And this is the thing that's just mind-boggling. Because if we truly had a democracy, if it was truly our representatives taking office and making sure the will of the people is done, then we wouldn't have these wars. If the people are turning out in the streets demanding it to stop, if they're demanding reform, if they want us to take steps to prevent ecological collapse and climate collapse, And you look at the numbers and the polls all across the world, and more than half the population in a given place generally wants these things. They want peace. They want equity. They want healthcare. They want safety nets. They want good infrastructure. They want clean water and clean air. They want a future for their children. They don't want war. And yet, the governments, acting against the interests of their people, make sure that we have endless war. And what can we do? What can we do? Peaceful protest, does it seem to be working right now? I don't know. Violent protest, does that seem to be working? That doesn't seem to be working either. So what kind of protest do we need to have as people? And this is what I've been chewing on. This is what I've been thinking. And this is what has just been stressing me out as I think of this. And I don't know what the answer is. How do we make change when we can pretty much roundly see that things aren't working, that business as usual isn't getting us any closer to peace? And all while we look around and realize that there are more of us than them, and that they are not serving or protecting us. What do we do? It's kind of like being a child or a teenager, and you're dependent on your parents, and you're watching them get drunk and argue about money and beat one another and just go running along in toxic circles of peace and reconciliation and violent eruption. And you never know what's going to happen and where, but it seems like whenever you ask mom and dad to stop fighting, they just tell you to go to your room, or they put on a smile in the moment, and then they go in their room and continue fighting out of sight. This is a bit like how I'm feeling at the moment when I look around the world. And I don't want to get grim and dark and just have a monologue where I'm talking about doom and all of this. I just want to bring these things to people's awareness and have people think about them. I'm going to just go into a little bit of a history of the timeline for Palestine, not going into the details of everything that happened here, but just to give you a rough timeline that sheds some light on the fact that things didn't just begin on October 7th. The point that I will pick for starting, and it's debatable, some people go back a little bit further into the late 1800s, but I'll start at 1917 with the Balfour Declaration. This was a moment where Britain, as a colonial empire, they owned the region that we now call Israel and Palestine. And they basically said, hey, let's set up, they were in talks with Zionists who wanted a state for the Jewish people. And they said, hey, you can have this state over here. And then you flash forward a bit in time, and there's the World War, there's the Holocaust, and now Jewish people all around Europe and the rest of the world are feeling like they'd really like a home, and there's this place that was granted to them. And so people started flooding there in record numbers. And when they got there, they found out that, oops, actually, it turns out that there are already indigenous peoples in this place. They were promised a home, and when they got there, they found that there were other people who had already had a home there. And so this is problematic, obviously. So in 47, Britain didn't really want to deal with this problem anymore, and they punted it over to the United Nations to sort out. And the United Nations basically said, hey, let's just partition the region. We'll have an Arab state there and a Jewish state there, and yeah, everybody will be happy. And this is basically the birth of Israel in 1947, 1948. And for the Palestinians, this is the time that they call the Nakba, which means catastrophe. And it was a time of ethnic cleansing and forced displacement of roughly 750,000 Palestinians. So conflict in the area continued to escalate. And when we get to the 80s, and of course things happened between 47 and 87, but I'm just giving you some quick bullet points here of the big facts, because I'm not a historian, I'm just a normal guy who's read some things. And in 87, this was the first intifada, where It was the first kind of violent uprising where people had tried peaceable protest. They tried to fight for their rights and it wasn't working. So something switched and they tried something different because they felt that they had no recourse by using peaceful methods. And this lasted until 93. There was the Oslo Accords at that point with Clinton. And this is the closest that we ever came to having a kind of peaceful negotiation in the region. But ultimately, things fell through and hostilities continued. We get to 2000. And from 2000 to 2005, we have the second Intifada, which is another surge of violent resistance in that region from Palestinians. In both cases, these were pretty violently squashed by the Israeli forces. And whenever you look at the death toll of the two sides, one thing that you'll notice is that there is a glaring disproportionate death count when you compare how many Israeli died to how many Palestinian people died. And this has to do with the might of colonial occupying forces and being funded by the United States to have an ally in the Middle East because it's strategically advantageous to have this. And so all of this just keeps going back and forth. There's a terror attack and then there's retribution. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. And then we get to October 7th. And October 7th, a huge number of innocent lives were lost in Israel in a terror attack from Hamas. And I want to take a second here just to note that in the same way that I condemn Israelis going in and indiscriminately killing innocent civilians, I also condemn Palestinians going in and killing innocent Israelis. The death of innocent civilians is a tragedy, no matter what the nationality, ethnicity, religion, creed of the civilian is, right? I think we can all agree on that. And yet when I'm online and I'm on social media or I'm on Reddit or I'm watching the way people interact with each other online, there's always someone wanting to try to make the case that, yeah, no one cares about the 1,000+ Israelis that were killed on October 7th and the others that were held captive and are still hostages. And I don't agree with this. I think if anyone is arguing and condemning terror and the loss of life, then they have to acknowledge that on both sides, this is wrong. And that's an easy thing to do. It's wrong. If it's Hamas doing it on October 7th, it's wrong. If it's Israel doing it in 1917, 1947, 1987, whatever year, all of the decades from then and now, it's wrong, on both sides. But as I mentioned before, when you look at the death tolls, there's one side that seems to really, really like killing the other. And I'm not sure why that is, but take a look at the data. I mean, right now, there have been officially roughly like 40,000 people, 40,000 civilians killed and 90,000 injured. And these are conservative estimates because in July, The Lancet, one of the world's highest impact and oldest peer-reviewed medical journals, reported that up to 186,000 Palestinians may be dead due to indirect and direct causes. And you might think, like, what does that mean? I thought you said it's like 40,000 people were killed. That's a pretty big disparity. That's a pretty wide margin of error. How could that be? But this medical journal basically made the case that when studying similar conflicts in the past, and I guess that's a hard thing to do because there haven't been many modern conflicts that have been this aggressive and had this level of civilian casualties in such a short time. It's actually staggering when you look at the numbers. So this one is a little atypical in that it has been much more aggressive. But when we look at these types of conflicts in general, you find that the numbers are undercounted because we don't account for things like long-term indirect deaths that come in the months and years after a conflict. from causes, reproductive harm, communicable and non-communicable diseases. When you have the destroyed healthcare infrastructure, severe shortages of food, the water, as I mentioned, the shelter destroyed, the population's inability to flee and find safe places, the loss of funding to organizations that are in the region trying to provide assistance and aid. All of these things, they give us a more holistic, comprehensive picture of a death toll. And this isn't even to count all of the thousands and thousands of bodies. I think I saw a statistic that said there's something like 10,000, maybe more bodies just in the rubble that haven't been found and can't be identified just because they're buried. They're buried and people can't find them. So this is pretty wild to think of that level of civilian casualties. And those are just the casualties, right? There are roughly 2 million people that have been displaced since October 7th. You might say, what does that mean? This is just a number. What does 2 million people mean? That's over 75% of the population in Gaza. And Gaza is just one part of Palestine, right? There's the West Bank, which isn't supposed to be included in the siege. And yet hundreds of Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank alone, with over 12,000 injured in the West Bank from settler attacks. And settler, you might hear this word and you might think, what is that? These are Israelis that have been encouraged by the government of Israel to go into Palestinian territory and illegally occupy the land there, often forcibly displacing Palestinians who live there by bulldozing their homes and attacking them and just forcing them out. And so there's something like 800,000 Israelis living illegally in Jerusalem and the West Bank, according to international law and recent Court of Justice rulings. So that's a pretty staggering number. And the thing about these settlers who are illegally occupying the land, according to international law, is that they get 24/7 access to piped, healthy, clean drinking water, while the Palestinians in those regions, they get a fraction of the allotment that they need. So their water source is choked while they watch people in beautiful communities with just endless, seemingly endless supplies of water. And in terms of water in Gaza, only 6% of the population in Gaza has access to safe drinking water. Think of that. That means 94% don't. And Israel's cutting of the external water supply, the systematic destruction of the water facilities that I mentioned earlier, their deliberate aid obstruction by they basically bulldoze the roads, destroy the roads, attack the aid trucks, and make it very difficult for aid to get into these people. So it reduces the amount of water available in Gaza. And roughly, each person has about 4.7 liters per day per person, which is under a third of the recommended minimum for emergencies and less than a single toilet flush. Just to put that in perspective. So this is what people are dealing with. And this isn't even to talk about like the cultural destruction that's happening there. Because Israelis are not just destroying things like roads, hospitals, water treatment. They're destroying things like ancient mosques, sacred religious sites. There's been photos and videos of them laughing in mosques, burning holy texts and scriptures. There is a cultural component of this that is perhaps more devastating than just destroying infrastructure and buildings. It is a kind of cultural erasure. And I don't know how else to say this, but these are coordinated civilian killing campaigns. They're targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, food services, water treatment facilities, agricultural centers, schools, hospitals, cultural heritage sites, like I mentioned. How do we look at this and and think that this is Israel defending itself? How do we think that this is a proportionate response to what happened on October 7th? When you're bombing schools and hospitals and agricultural centers and mosques and burning books, you've gone beyond retribution. You have become something depraved at this point. You're seeing red. You are acting as someone deranged. And I want to talk about the hospital aspect of this for a second, because that's also pretty crazy. Because at the beginning of this conflict, there were a lot of people arguing that, come on, Israel isn't deliberately bombing hospitals. That's crazy to say that. However, Gazan health facilities have been just crippled by the attacks from October onwards. By December, only 2 months after the conflict started, 23 of the 36 hospitals had been forced to close because of damage or lack of electricity. The World Health Organization reported that 600 patients and medical personnel were killed in attacks on medical facilities, including 76 ambulances. Hospitals were operating at 5% of capacity while being overwhelmed with wounded and sick people, with hospital bed occupancy at 310%. It's just staggering to think about that. People were in makeshift shelters, stuck without proper care. Hospitals were overcrowded. There were incidents recorded where there was one toilet to be used for 486 people. No clean water or sanitation. This causes a surge in other sicknesses and diseases and illnesses like respiratory problems, stomach infections, and over 1,000 injured children had legs amputated in inadequate conditions, according to UNICEF. By mid-December alone, only 2 months into the assault, 93% of people in Gaza were starving, according to the World Health Organization, making them vulnerable to death from otherwise curable diseases, with pregnant and breastfeeding women at particular risk. So imagine being pregnant when all of this is happening and all the hospitals are being bombed. Your home is being bombed. Your family is being shot. And you have no access to clean drinking water. There's no food. Aid can't come in. And you're in a hospital that is operating at 5% capacity. It's nightmare fuel. It's complete nightmare fuel. And this is just about the hospitals, right? Like inside the hospitals, the doctors and the medics are reporting intentional harm and the killing of children by Israeli forces. And you might be wondering, like, well, yeah, that sounds like that could be propaganda. How could they know that the harm was intentional? This is a war. People get hurt. This happens. It's not intentional. How can we say that the children were being intentionally targeted? That's a pretty wild and outrageous thing to say. How can they substantiate that? Well, they can substantiate that because children are being brought in or found with gunshot wounds to the head, to the abdomen and body. This isn't rubble falling on the children and crushing them, or bombs blowing them to pieces, but that happens frequently too. These are children with gunshot wounds to the head and body, being found or brought in. And it gets worse. In a briefing from Save the Children's operations lead in the emergency health unit in Gaza in the last weeks, they stated that Palestinian children are reporting sexual abuse and rape at the hands of Israeli forces. Children. So children are being shot, maimed, killed, blown apart, raped, held hostage, placed in detention centers. There's no food, no water. The food security situation in the Gaza Strip is deteriorating due to the critical shortages of aid commodities, as well as ongoing hostilities, insecurity, damaged roads, access limitation, and breakdown of law and order. More than 1 million people did not receive any food rations in southern and central Gaza during August. And families will only be able to receive one food parcel during the September distribution cycle. How could more than 1 million people not receive any food rations? The situation is so dire and so grim. The Secretary General of the United Nations called it a humanitarian hellscape. And I don't know what else to call it. And before I mentioned that children were also being detained and tortured. And Palestinian people in general, since 2001, Israel has held 100,000 Palestinians in administrative detention without charge. Over that same period, the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel logged 1,400 cases of severe torture with only 2 criminal investigations and no convictions. Another staggering fact, since 1967, Israel has imprisoned 40% of Palestinian men for at least a week, along with more than 10,000 Palestinian women and 13,000 children. It's incomprehensible. It's unfathomable. And I haven't even gone into a deep dive on the environmental impacts. Maybe I'll save that for a subsequent episode, because I'm feeling fatigued by thinking of these things and talking about them. Just to close the loop on this torture, there's a torture prison called Sidi Taiman. Forgive my pronunciation, I'll put it in the show notes, where the abuses are insane. The reports of rape and torture of the prisoners, sodomy with rifles and electric weapons, people dying from just ruptured rectums. The things that are happening there are, people need to know about it. It's the human rights violations and abuses are it makes Guantanamo Bay look like a picnic. And what do we do with all this information? What do we do with all this stuff that I just mentioned here? With the potentially 186,000 Palestinians dead. With the population there having no access to clean drinkable water, no food, with waste just spilling in because all the waste treatment facilities are destroyed, the hospitals being destroyed. What do we do with this information? With the illegal detentions, the killings, the cultural destruction, the 4,000 Palestinian hostages in Israel, the millions of displaced people, all of the harm to children, the rape, killing, maiming, torture, the environmental impacts. What do we do about all of this? I don't know. But we need to be talking about it. We need people to know that in October of 2023 alone, the Israeli army dropped about 25,000 tons of munitions on the Gaza Strip. That's roughly 1.5 times the explosive force of Hiroshima during World War II. 1.5 times on one of the most densely populated places on Earth. So that should give you a sense of how severe and how disproportionate the response has been. The climate cost of those first 60 days of Israel's military response was equivalent to burning 150,000 tons of coal. The emissions from the first 2 months exceeded the annual carbon footprint of over 20 climate vulnerable nations. It's I'm exhausted from thinking of this. And I don't have a way to bounce us up and take us out of here and make things feel happy and good and okay, because right now they're not. And they haven't been for a long, long time in Palestine, as you can see. So I hope that there's a way to find peace here. I hope that the people of Israel can overthrow this militaristic right wing regime on a depraved, genocidal, ethnic cleansing campaign, because they're invading the West Bank now too. There's been a siege on Jenin for the last week. People are being killed, forced out, bulldozed, run over. The roads are being destroyed. It's the carnage is not limited to Gaza right now, and it seems to be expanding. So what do we do to contain this? I hope that people can come together. I hope that the United States, who plays such a pivotal role in all of this, they fund this. They funnel so much money into this. I hope that the American people turn out in numbers enough to stop this, to grant a ceasefire. And I hope that when there is a ceasefire, Israeli people and Palestinian people can come together and find a way to peaceably stop this conflict. And like I said, I'm just a normal guy. I'm not an expert on this. I don't have solutions. I just see that there is terrible, terrible trauma and harm and pain and suffering and death. And it doesn't need to be this way. We can be good to one another. We can imagine a better, happier, more peaceful, forgiving, just, loving world. So let's just try to have a minute of silence. I haven't done this in a while. I haven't done the meta minute, but let's really try to all do this. If you can, just take some time out of your day every day, even if it's just 1 or 2 minutes, to send empathy and love. Just take a minute or 2 minutes out of your day every day to send some love and empathy and care to the people in Israel, in Palestine, to the people who are suffering, who are hurting, who are scared. And let's just do that now. Okay. Thanks for listening. Please talk about these kind of things. Have conversations with people. Have respectful conversations with people. Read about it. And do what you can to try to make a positive difference here. Be good to one another, and I will talk to you next week.